Hi, my name is Stephen Reed, Mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, introducing 382, Organizing for the Future, a look at how today's leaders are taking notes and using the blueprint of yesterday's pioneers of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Please enjoy the film.
Hello everyone. It is truly an honor to help commemorate the 65th anniversary of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, considered the first large-scale demonstration against segregation in the United States. And I am clear that I am speaking to you as Vice President-elect of the United States because of all that happened in Montgomery in December of 1955 and the months that followed. Because of the courage, resilience, and fortitude of Rosa Macaulay Parks, because of the men and women who made the bus boycott possible, domestic workers and members of civic and faith organizations who walked and carpooled during that tumultuous time, because of the Americans of all races, faiths, and backgrounds who rallied to the cause. They, together with a 26-year-old leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., ignited a movement that continues to this day. And we must honor them and all our ancestors, not only with words, but with deeds, by carrying their work forward and doing all we can, from changing laws to changing hearts, to make our country more equal and more just. I was in Montgomery this past March, and I had a chance to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum. It was a powerful experience and a reminder that we need to reckon with our history honestly in order to move forward as a nation. To those of you who took part in the bus boycott, and those of you keeping its legacy alive today, President-elect Biden and I offer our profound gratitude and encouragement, and we look forward to working with you and all Americans to advance our ideals of equality, justice, and opportunity for all in the months and the years ahead. In the words of Congressman John Lewis, who was, of course, himself inspired by Rosa Parks and Dr. King and all the leaders in Montgomery 65 years ago, "Let us walk with the wind, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be our guide."
There's just so much hurt, disappointment, and oppression one can take. The line between reason and madness grows thinner. These are the words of Rosa Parks, but rang true for so many in Montgomery, Alabama, in the Jim Crow South. In 1954, passengers had to sit at the back of the bus in a section designated as colored. If a white person got on the bus and there were no free seats, the law said a black person would have to get up and let the white person sit down. Black citizens wanted to do something about this unfair practice. Joanne Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State College and president of the Women's Political Council, met with city officials to complain. 1, black riders had to stand even when there were empty seats in the white-only section. 2, there were too few bus stops in black neighborhoods. And 3, black passengers had to pay their fares at the front of the bus, get off, and then get back on to sit at the rear. City officials turned a deaf ear to these complaints. Joanne Robinson warned the mayor that there was growing support for a community boycott of the bus system. This warning would manifest the very next year. On March 2, 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old girl, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. On October 21st, Mary Louise Smith, another teenager, was arrested for the same reason. As arrests and indignities grew, the Women's Political Council and the NAACP also grew in strength and membership. Then, on Thursday, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a well-respected woman trained in school desegregation at the Highlander School, was arrested for not giving up her seat to a white man. This was the moment when the people said, enough. Joanne Robinson and 2 students hastily mimeographed tens of thousands of flyers calling for a boycott of the buses the next Monday. They activated a support network to get the word out and dropped off bundles of flyers at stores, bars, factories, barbershops, and beauty parlors. By Friday afternoon, word of the boycott spread to every Black man, woman, and child. On Monday, December 5th, 1955, almost 90% of Black people boycotted the buses in Montgomery. With that success, Joanne Robinson approached Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, pastors of 2 of the largest Black congregations in the city, and asked for their support. Under Dr. King's leadership, the Montgomery Improvement Association was founded. That night, thousands of Black citizens gathered for a mass meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church, and the MIA decided to extend the boycott. Dr. King said to the crowd, "We're going to work with grim and bold determination to gain justice on the buses in this city." And we are not wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. Black leaders continued to reach out to city officials to demand fair treatment, but officials attempted to enforce their will with harassment and arrest. Still, Black people did not get on the buses. On February 1st, 1956, right after the homes of Martin Luther King Jr. and E.D. Nixon were bombed, attorneys Fred Gray and Charles Langford filed a petition, Browder v. Gale, in federal district court, arguing Alabama law and Montgomery city ordinances requiring segregation on buses were unconstitutional. In June, the federal district court ruled in their favor. This was the beginning of the end. The case went on to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in November of 1956, the highest court in the land struck down racial segregation on buses. Their long battle was won at last when the Supreme Court's injunction to desegregate the buses was delivered to city officials on December 20th. And on December 21st, 382 days after it began, the boycott was over. The legacy of these brave and selfless people became the blueprint for the civil rights movement, and until this day continues to push this nation toward economic equality and racial justice.
Greetings and welcome to the 65th anniversary of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, 382 days of organizing for the future. We have with us Dr. Howard Robinson, professor at Alabama State University, and we also have Mr. Lloyd Howard, a local businessman and member of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Mr. Howard, I'd like to start with you. Tell us what it was like growing up in Montgomery during the time of the bus boycott.
Montgomery was a different kind of city, so growing up during the boycott was exciting to us because we knew the players. Mrs. Parks worked right across the street from us. Her husband worked in the shop with us, my brother and myself. My brother ran the shop, and Mr. Parks was one of the barbers there. So when the movement started, we got right involved because we realized that it was something that was different. It was exciting. The person that made contact with us right from the start was E.D. Nixon. He came down and asked the barbers and cab drivers and everybody to be ready for a bus boycott. In that time, in that short period, from the 1st to the 5th, they had organized the Montgomery Improvement Association on the 5th morning of the 5th at Dixie Avenue Church. They started a meeting and then they moved to Mount Zion Church that evening. Nobody knew at that time who was going to lead the movement because they had not selected a person to lead it. They had some people there who was concerned about leadership because Dr. King wasn't but 26 years old. At the last vote of who was going to lead, they selected Dr. King. I call it divine intervention. When we got to the church, Holt Street Church, that night, the crowd was, it was unbelievable. You never seen anything like it. Church was full, the balcony was full, people standing on the outside. And when Dr. King walked to the podium, when Wilson introduced him, walked to the podium, about 3 minutes in his speech, you knew that he was a one. He was a one, with nothing like it. People were on their feet and shaking their hands, and they were just thrilled over what he was saying to them, because he was trying to convince black folk that they had the same rights of anybody else in the country. And if you listen to his earlier speech, that's what he kept saying. And the Monday night movement speech, he kept repeating it. Let folk know, don't walk away. This is important. We're gonna have to make sure that we boycott the bus.
Dr. Robinson, tell us a little bit about the organizing of the movement, some of the events that led to the political organizing and how effective that organization was, considering the climate that Montgomery was at the time.
It's interesting because you have the bus boycott, which is really a culmination in and of itself. So on transportation, public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama, there had been a long history of clashes between at first it was really the trolley. So from the 1880s into the turn of the century, you had trolley transportation in Montgomery. Montgomery had one of the nation's first trolley systems. And there was a 2-year boycott of the black community of the trolley system to overcome segregated trolleys. And black people in Montgomery were successful at that. And you really see this come to a crescendo in the 1950s. In 1946, Alabama State professor Mary Fairburks, English professor, she is interested in joining the League of Women's Voters, but the race does not allow for her membership. At the same time, she has an incident. She's driving. She's trying to get around a bus. She almost hits a white woman. The white woman is irate, cusses Dr. Fairburks out, and then Mary Fairburks is arrested, fined, charged, and so she sees this as unfair. And so she goes to her church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and she hears her minister, Vernon Johns, deliver a sermon that really transforms her thinking. And so she puts her anger into action. She translates that frustration into action. And she forms what she calls the Women's Political Council. It's an organization of women who are going to address some of the ills in society in Montgomery, and they're going to educate black people on the political process. They start to do voter registration, literacy classes. They start a program called Youth City, where they have mock elections for the students, black students at high schools. It's really a dynamic organization. But one of the issues that they are really dealing with is the bus issue. And so there are a number of arrests. In 1955 alone, Mary Louise Smith is arrested, Claudette Colvin is arrested, Janet Reese is arrested, Susie McDonald is arrested. So there's a number of people arrested in just that year. And so the Women's Political Council had thought about a bus boycott. They started, and they pushed for a bus boycott, but they wanted to be able to collaborate with Edie Nixon, the labor organizer. They wanted to be able to collaborate with the totality of the black leadership in Montgomery. And they were also always told to hold on, to hold back.
The Montgomery Bus Boycott was one of the most phenomenal and profound movements, social action movements in American and even world history. Men, black males, led the organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association. They were the key spokespersons. They were the strategists. But women, in the origin of the movement, in its evolution, in its successful conclusion, played extremely important roles. In fact, were it not for women, particularly working class women, the Montgomery Bus Boycott would not have succeeded. Black women received the brunt of discrimination and the abuse that blacks overall received on local buses, with white male drivers assaulting them. They were very insensitive and indecent to black women, calling them all kinds of names. And they had arrested black women who resisted their commands. So we mentioned the Women's Political Council, founded in 1949 by Dr. Mary Fair Burks of Alabama State University. She was chair of the English department. And she had an altercation with a policeman and a white woman on Montgomery Street that led her to found this organization that she called the Women's Political Council. Now, the next year, 1950, Joanne Robinson, also an English teacher at ASU, succeeded Burks as president of the Women's Political Council. And you see these black working class women mainly bringing to the Women's Political Council their concerns for how they were treated on buses. So by 1954 and 55, Robinson and the Women's Political Council, made up of middle-class women, had decided that going through the city council and the city commission, where they'd done nothing about the conditions on buses, had decided on a boycott. They didn't know when, they didn't know who would be the person to stimulate the followership on their idea, but they decided on a boycott. So the night of Rosa Parks' arrest, Rosa Parks was arrested December 1st, 1955, was a Thursday evening. On that evening, about 12 o'clock in the evening, Joanne Robinson and two of our students went into an ASU building on campus and produced 50,000 flyers announcing a one-day boycott to take place on the day of Rosa Parks' trial, the next Monday, December 5th. And these working class women carried the boycott by walking, when the boycott started, walking to their destinations. Think about walking every day for 382 days in all kinds of weather. Now you are maids, these women are maids and cooks and the like, but they gave up their welfare to take part in this event. And you know, I read a story that, a quote that said that there were no complaints. You might have heard of this black woman, her name was Mother Pollard, an old black woman, was questioned by a reporter who asked Mother Pollard, "Oh woman, aren't you tired of walking?" And she said, "My feet is tired, my soul is rested." These same working class black women attended in great numbers the boycott's mass meetings. These were twice weekly meetings at local churches. They were part strategy, part informational, part spiritual. And you see these maids and these cooks coming from a hard day of work and a hard day walking to and fro to these mass meetings at local churches. And at the mass meetings, they participated, they asked questions. And also, black middle-class women testified at two trials that took place during the boycott. There was one trial in March 1956 where Dr. King was on trial for being one of about 90 leading blacks of the boycott, so the city said, who caused a boycott and violated a 1921 state anti-boycott law and were arrested in February 1956. And you see the city calling these women, black women, not black men, to testify against King. One black woman they called was a middle-class black woman. She was Thelma Glass. Didn't King lead you into boycotting? He's your leader, right? And one person said, "We is our own leader." But let me also mention two working class women's groups that raised money for the boycott. That was a club called the Club from Nowhere. Have you heard of Georgia Gilmore? Georgia Gilmore was a working class black woman, and she wanted to raise money for the boycott, and she organized a club called the Club from Nowhere. They sold sandwiches and desserts and meals, and they raised hundreds of dollars almost every week for the boycott, bringing it to mass meetings. There's another club called the Friendly Club, organized by Georgia Gilmore's rival, Inez Ricks, also raised money by selling meals for the boycott. So here are these women having experienced decades of injustice on city buses, taking a position, taking part in the boycott, and it were enough for them agreeing to walk those days, coming to the mass meetings, making their voices heard in these two trials. Great courage, great strength on the part of both middle-class women and working-class women. And again, were it not for women altogether, middle-class and working-class women, the boycott would not have succeeded.
Dr. Robinson, walk us through the organization of the Women's Political Council to the impetus of the mass meeting, what were some of the key factors that played a role in the organization of the Women's Political Council to the mobilization of those hundreds of people that gathered for the meeting?
You had a number of organizations that have been collaborating over the course of a number of years. It was an egregious situation on the buses. The women and the leadership, Mary Fairburks has her experiences on the buses. Joanne Robinson, who's the president of the Women's Political Council, in 1955, she has her own experience where she thought that the bus driver was going to punch her in the face. And she, as he approached her in a threatening way, demanding that she move out of the section in the middle where blacks and whites could sit, and threatened her with physical violence. She ran off the bus and had to call someone to come pick her up. So these are the people who became the leaders of the Women's Political Council. There's about 100 women centered at Alabama State University, but then there's 2 other branches of the Women's Political Council in Montgomery. So it's about 300 black women. And so when they mobilize, they send their tentacles throughout the city. Plus, they mobilize Alabama State students to help them distribute those flyers. And so you have the Women's Political Council sort of sparking the bus boycott. And then the men step in and create the Montgomery Improvement Association.
As we know, the mass meetings played a major role in the success of the bus protests. Mr. Howard, can you tell us a little bit about the mass meetings and how so many people were able to mobilize so quickly, considering the insults that the people were receiving on the buses?
The mass meeting was impacted because people were kind of fed up with the way they're being treated, because that I mentioned to you before that was really egregious was you sitting on the bus, one white man get on the bus and he got 6 seats to sit in, and they make you get out of your seat. Nobody sit in that seat. You have to stand up over an empty seat that you paid for. So people were upset. So when they called a mass meeting, I think people just was ready to do something about what was happening, because once you see that, no matter where you're sitting on the bus, you upset, because you sitting already in the colored area. The bus driver get up and move his little piece back over your head and then tell you to get up and move back. And nobody's sitting in the seat. That's what people would get angry about. We had accepted segregation. It was part of our everyday life. When the movement started and those meetings, Monday night meetings, most people came, no matter what walk of life you were on, maids, cooks, porters, whoever you was, you came to the meeting to see what's gonna be done. And after, I guess, the second meeting, you realize that this is a movement that might just do pretty good. Everybody was a little bit leery from the start because they thought that black folk probably wouldn't last over 2 or 3 weeks. But once the movement started and Dr. King with that powerful voice letting you know you deserve the same rights of everybody else, I think that at that point, that got to be where if you didn't get to the church early, you wasn't gonna get a seat.
And so what happens with the mass meetings, and I think is very interesting, is that they form what I think becomes part of the formula for the modern civil rights movement, in that King brings to this formula civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. The mass meeting marries the middle-class leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association with the masses of people. And so how do you know what to do? You go to the mass meetings. Where do you get your energy and where are you rejuvenated, in the mass meeting? Where does the Montgomery Improvement Association come back and tell the community what is happening with the bus boycott, how negotiations are faring with the city, and then seeking the community's input and permission to move forward. That all is happening in the mass meetings. And so initially they're once a week, but they're so popular and so voluminous that people come, they have to have 2 mass meetings a week, and they're sharing them with, at churches all throughout town. And so the mass meeting brings together another element, and it is steeped in the church. So you have the Montgomery Bus Boycott is steeped in the church, civil disobedience and nonviolence, mass mobilization, and then of course with Fred Gray and his insistence on the lawsuit. That formula is going to be replicated time and time again during the 1960s as black people in the United States attacked the system of racial discrimination and segregation.
So what were some of the main means of communication? Because in order to sustain something for 381 days, there has to be a significant, strong current of accurate information being given. How was that done?
Most of it was direct information. You have to remember, WSFA wasn't but a year old. You couldn't get one announcement at WSFA at that time. The radio station was owned by white folk. So from time to time, the black program, you would get a announcement, but it wasn't like it was going all day. But you had these information sheets that they would send out. They would bring some downtown to where we were. We put them in cabs, and we'd tell the guys to give them to folk in the community to put out. That kind of information was spread through word of mouth and through the sheets of paper that they had. It was the next mass meeting, who was going to be the guest speaker that night. If the meeting was that Monday, that Tuesday, Wednesday, we would have the sheets showing people where they, and that was very well done. We put it in mailboxes, everything.
You had like young people like Claudette Colvin, Mary Louise Smith, who got involved very early and who were at ground zero. Because the other 2 plaintiffs were of age, but here you have young people. Were young people as ignited as their seniors?
I wasn't but 15 years old. Well, that December, I was 14 to turn 15 in that January. I had a group of folk that I knew that was involved because most of your information sheets that were given out, we had to deliver it to homes and wherever we would find black folk to let them know where the next mass meeting was going to be. Not but a few of us living now, but we had quite a few young people got involved, because that was your source of transportation too. If you were going from the north side or the west side of Montgomery to Alabama State, you would catch the bus. If you were coming from Washington Park area, in that area, you would catch the bus, and because a lot of folk didn't have cars. So if you were a young person, it was exciting for you to hear that, hey, for the first time, we're going to change this on the bus. We're not going to have empty seats that we have to stand over. So we got involved.
You've seen bad, you've been happy and sad. but you gotta stay focused and never lose sight. I know people, they don't see the hurt you feel inside, but you gotta keep smiling, 'cause everything will be alright. Better days. I believe it, I receive it. Anybody know better day? Better days coming.
How were whites organizing to, or responding rather, to the mobilization of black people?
The white South responded really initially to the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1955. And so, sometimes you talk about conspiracy, but this is a real conspiracy. There are attorneys generals, including the attorney general from Alabama, who meet in Birmingham, Alabama, and try to work out ways to attack the newly handed down Brown versus Board of Education desegregation ruling. And they realize after brainstorming several days that they're not going to be able to overcome this Supreme Court decision. And so they come away with the idea that they're going to oppose and delay at every turn. And so what develops out of that is this idea of massive resistance, that the white South is going to resist desegregation at every element or in every phase of life. And so the park system has to be desegregated separately from a water fountain, from the library. All these entities have to be attacked and adjudicated and dealt with individually. And so the court case and the legal component is a critical element of that, but the mass meeting allows for the Montgomery Improvement Association to draw sustenance from the people, draw support, economic support to fight the litigations, to provide a car service, a makeshift transportation network. The Montgomery Improvement Association wanted to get a license to have a transportation network, a franchise. They were denied by the city. They wanted to start a banking system. They were denied the proper permission. So they were far thinking in their mobilization. And again, it sets the template for the modern civil rights movement.
The Montgomery Citizen Council had organized in the same block where you have the mayor's office and the city council office now.
Yes, sir.
That was the city. It wasn't nothing on Ripper Street. The whole Montgomery was small. Our business was in the same block, ironically enough. So when they had white mass meetings, they had to put speakers on the outside because it would crowd out the auditorium so we could hear everything they were saying. So we passed the information on to E.D. Nixon, Reverend Say, and those guys, what they had planned. They started what they call a Fire Your Nigga campaign from that meeting one night, and the white folk come out on the street. They're talking about firing your nigga. Get rid of your nigga, whoever you got working for you. It scared a lot of black folk, because they were working downtown. Some were working with white folk, and that lasted for a little while. But then you'd find out that they couldn't get rid of black folk because it was very slave labor anyway. No white boy want to do that. Right, so that didn't go that far. But you had signs in windows downtown Montgomery said about fire your nigga.
The White Citizens Council was a way that white people who thought that the Ku Klux Klan was too radical, too violent, and they wanted a more respectable way to do the same thing, to fight segregation, to fight against efforts to eliminate discrimination. And so the White Citizen Council was a phenomenon that grew out of Mississippi and spread throughout the South, but was huge in Montgomery. You had the city commissioners join the White Citizens Council, to say that this is the side we're taking, the side of segregation and white supremacy. And so that's what Black people in Montgomery face.
Mr. Howard, can you tell us a little bit about what was taking place, just before the protests ended? People assumed that, the white power structure was caving in, when in all actuality things were intensifying, as you had stated. You had massive arrests taking place, you had people getting fired, and you had an increase in rhetoric from downtown, from the mayor. Tell us a little bit about how things intensified before the order came down to end the segregation.
Before the order came down, the white folk were trying to put as much pressure on Black folk as they possibly could. But at that time, Black folk had bought into the movement. There wasn't nothing going to scare them anymore. Black women and men saying, well, we're going to stay with Dr. King. When he says over, it'll be over. But we're not going to let no white folk tell us when this movement is over. They believed in him. They believed in what he was saying. They were locked into the movement. So there were no changes. There were no changes. You checked the buses was empty. After a while, you realize that anybody who started talking about getting on the bus, you get checked up from your own brother. So, no, man, you don't want to do that. Yeah, we were the movement. Whether you were a street guy or teacher, whoever you were, there wasn't no turning around at that point.
So I made a commitment while I was a student at Alabama State that Black people had a problem in Montgomery. And it was a problem with segregation in general and particularly with the buses. I didn't know anything about any lawyers, but they told me that lawyers help people to solve problems. So I decided maybe in addition to being a preacher, I'd be a lawyer. I finished Alabama State in May of 1951, enrolled in what was then Western Reserve University in Cleveland, finished law school in 3 years. I left there and came to Montgomery. I am now ready to begin destroying everything segregated I could find. When I returned to Montgomery, I already knew the key persons in Montgomery who was interested in civil rights. I knew Mr. E.D. Nixon, who was then president of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. He was a Pullman car puller by profession. I also knew about Mrs. Rosa Parks. Mrs. Parks was the secretary to the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. She was interested in the same thing I was interested in, and that is in doing away with segregation and discrimination. From the time I opened my office in the latter part of September 1954 until Mrs. Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955, almost 4 or 5 days a week during lunch hour, Ms. Parks would walk from her store to my office, and we would have our lunch together, and we would talk about conditions as they existed. Mrs. Parks never told me that she was going to refuse to get up and give her seat. I knew, or I believed, that if the opportunity ever presented itself, that she wouldn't give up that seat. I was out of town. When I got back, I found out she had been arrested. Got calls from her. And so my case is set for Monday at 8:30 in the Recorder's Court of the City of Montgomery. And I want you to represent me. I told her I would. I told her, I said, Mrs. Parks, don't worry about your case. I'm gonna handle it. I'll be back in touch with you between now and Monday. But if we're going to do something about the buses, we need to do something so that we won't have this problem every 2 or 3 days. So what I'm going to do when I leave here, I'm going to go and talk to Mr. Nixon. He got you out of jail. He knows everything. I know Joanne Robinson is interested in getting the community involved in trying to keep people off of the buses until they can go back on a non-discriminatory basis. Our people stayed off of the buses. And one of the reasons they stayed off of the buses is E.D. Nixon did something that if he had asked any of us to do, we probably would have told him not to do. We were trying to we wanted black people to know to stay off the buses. We didn't want white people to know what we were doing. E.D. Nixon had a friend, a newspaper reporter at the Advertiser that he could trust. He called that reporter and told him what we black folks were planning on doing on Monday. So instead of it being a secret Sunday morning, because it couldn't have been a secret because all these preachers were talking about what they was going to do, but it was the headlines in the Montgomery Advertiser on Sunday that black folks plan to stay off of the buses on Monday. One of the best things ever happened to us. Because a lot of folks who didn't know about it, it then became a news item. And so those folks who didn't know, knew, and they stayed off of the buses. It just happened during the course of this event that we had these bombings, including the bombing of Dr. King's house. We concluded that now is a good time to file the case of Browder versus Gale. But I had to be sure that they were the right persons. I wanted Claudette Carvin's case and wanted Claudette to be one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. So I contacted her parents and they agreed. In addition to that, the community had brought Mary Louise Smith, who had been arrested some time later. And I had talked to her and I had approved her. And then there was Miss Susie McDonald, who was a retired teacher. She was rather old, aged, but she was a good person. But then Mrs. Aurelia Browder, who was just the right age, very articulate, one I thought would serve good as a lead plaintiff in the lawsuit. So I named her as the lead plaintiff. And so we then had these 4 persons, a total of 5, who became plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale. That case was filed in the Federal District Court in Montgomery. So we filed the suit. It was assigned to the judges. We got a hearing, and ultimately we got a decision in that case before summer in 1956. And ultimately the Supreme Court granted our motion to affirm the decision of the lower court, which means that what started out to be a one-day protest developed into staying off of the buses for 382 days, a little more than a year.
So when the order came down, okay, where were you? What was it like in the city when the news was reached that there was no longer a need for a boycott? What did King say to the people that encouraged them to savor the moment?
I think we had heard that day that the order was down. We didn't know what it was, but we heard from some people that the order had come down and it was going to be in favor of the protest, the bus boycott. But that night, I didn't go to the mass meeting that night because we knew it was going to happen. But when people left, they were excited because they realized at that point that they had won. You know, the bus boycott was over, we won. And I think Dr. King got back on the bus and rode the bus through the city and let people know it was time to get back to the bus. But one caveat, the young people were celebrating too much, and Dr. King told us, you're going to have to calm down. The second phase of the movement is going to be much more challenging than the bus boycott. And, you know, we started to think about what he was talking about because we were focused on the bus boycott. But at that point, you know, he already had in his toolbox was the lunch counters, getting bus drivers, all the things that he had, integrated schools and all of that, you know. So once he explained it to the black community that the next phase was going to get started and started soon, you know, we were excited about it.
So, Dr. Robinson, looking at the evolution of King, you know, as a leader, from coming to Montgomery to do work on his doctoral dissertation to becoming pastor at what is now Dexter King Memorial Avenue Baptist Church to being the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Talk a little bit about the role that boycott played in maturing African Americans nationwide in civil disobedience and protest.
During the bus boycott, really the people who embraced this idea of nonviolent civil disobedience, and there was a community of people, pacifists, other people in different parts of the nation who wanted to see a movement like what was happening in Montgomery. They started reaching out, and King started to get visitors to Montgomery, and they started to talk to him about, you know, the theoretical and the philosophical underpinnings of nonviolent civil disobedience, and they expanded his understanding of the phenomenon and the approach and strategy, and they realized that what was happening in Montgomery could be applicable to the South in general, and so they were thinking about replicating the Montgomery experience throughout this nation, but particularly throughout the South. The Montgomery Improvement Association and King as its leader really was an audition for the coming direct action phase of the Montgomery bus boycott. And so there was a number of nonviolent workshops that started to take place in Montgomery. These nonviolent or pacifist luminaries from all over the nation would start to come. Students were participating. Folks from the community were participating. And they started to hammer out the idea of taking the Montgomery experience and applying it region-wide. What grows out of the Montgomery bus boycott, with, again, mirroring the Montgomery Improvement Association, is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And its mission is really to replicate what the Montgomery Improvement Association did in Montgomery, to replicate that throughout the South. And so it's the same structure. You know, really, a lot of the people who were in the Montgomery Improvement Association, Reverend Solomon Say, Ralph Abernathy, all these folks are going to become the founding members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they're going to stay with that organization and grow that organization. And so King cuts his teeth in Montgomery as the leader of the civil rights movement here in Montgomery. It's a jumping off point, a catalyst to his becoming the leader of the civil rights movement in the nation, and really recognized around the world as a civil rights luminary and leader. That had its origins here in Montgomery. And so that's why I say the Montgomery Improvement Association sets the template for the modern civil rights movement, because the direct action phase, which is so incredibly productive, is possible because it applies the lessons that King learned here in Montgomery.
Mr. Howard, last question. What do you think we need to know about the boycott that is the most important to you, having experienced it? What lesson do we need to get from it? What do we need to emphasize, and what will at least satisfy you that we have touched on the major theme of the movement?
You know, we talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott and its impact, and it did have impact, you know, for its changing the way people felt about the city and the activities that he had. But the greatest impact for the movement is that for the first time, it forced black folk together. They changed the way they looked at each other. There was a brotherhood, sisterhood that was not present before the movement. And I think that impact probably went through the nation greater than anything else. We had a friend, Stokely Carmichael, used to come to town, and he used to say to us, he said, you know, you guys go get killed here. You can't stay in this movement without losing your life. And he'd always say to us, you don't think you all need to move? And we would tell Stokely, say, look, man, we can't move. There's too many people here who depend on the kind of relationship that we build with young people and trying to create that brotherhood, sisterhood, and we have a large family, so we couldn't move. So that kind of relationship lasted, and it's still lasting to now. To watch Montgomery go from a solid white city to a black city where you got a black mayor, a black police chief, black sheriff, it almost to the point where I get emotional. Yeah. Sometimes I ride alone. Some days I didn't think I'd live that long. I just didn't think I'd live that long to see that much change. For a city to go to solid, hardcore, mean-spirited white till now, in just about every aspect of this city and county, you got a black person in charge. So that probably is the most impact, and it works. The relationship works between each other. There's no infighting there. It might have some decisions that are different from others, but it works. You know? And that's exciting, really exciting.
We went from tending the fields from dawn till night to marching arm in arm for our civil rights. And no one said it was going to be easy. Along the way, it's been a lot of pain and struggle, like the Sunday morning we were forced to shift through the rubble of 16th Street Baptist Church. Yes, that still hurts the way we lost those 4 little girls to that bomb. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. And since birth, I always wondered why we had to be separated just to ride a bus or be fed, when if you cut a white and black man, we both bleed red. It makes no sense to me. But see, that was history. Thanks to the heroic endeavors of leaders like Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers, the late nights of hose pipes and dog bites are a thing of the past. And the last, we're free at last. And I do thank God Almighty we're free at last. I do have to ask, now what's holding black back as we head to the future? Why is it that it's more news stories of our violence than our achievements, the way media perceives us as troublemakers instead of innovators, like Garrett Morgan or George Washington Carver? You see, my brothers and sisters, we have to work harder because the odds are still stacked against us. And it's a must you trust my words when I say, if you don't let your potential turn kinetic, there will be a time you do regret it. So get up, move, step off into your purpose and network if need be. But see, the year-long bus boycott of the march for Selma to Montgomery, it happened a step at a time, a day at a time, from brothers and sisters that came together for the same cause. So what's yours?
And we're continuing our discussion on the 382 days of organizing for the future. We have with us 2 emerging leaders in social justice, Kanisha Brown and Dylan Nettles. And we're going to be talking about the relationship between the Montgomery Bus Boycott and current social justice issues. We'll begin with Ms. Brown. Does the Montgomery Bus Boycott motivate young people today to take a stand against social injustice?
Oh, most definitely. I'm a native here in Montgomery. And growing up, I've heard stories all the time through my grandmother and other relatives of what they endured and what happened during the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And even though we did not learn the ins and outs of the boycott in our schooling, we still had our neighbors in our village to kind of tell us what's going on in present day. And I think one thing that we are learning from the boycott is pretty much resiliency in terms of just kind of staying the course, keeping focus, and understanding that things don't happen overnight. It takes, a lot of organizing to strategize, to make things, go into fruition. And I think that we kind of hold that into present day. And you've seen different other movements in present day, and not really in terms of a boycott, but what we're seeing, what happened with Black Lives Matter, when it started with Trayvon Martin, even going now to in 2020 with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We're not just, and when I'm saying we, I'm just saying people around the country, they're not just going to the streets in one day and then going home the next day. What they're doing is applying pressure day in, day out, around the clock to see change. So most definitely, we're using what we got from the boycott to present day.
And Mr. Nettles, how does the boycott play a role in policy making today? What have you as a young advocate learned that impacts policy making?
Well, the truth is the boycott gave us the blueprint, and those are the same tools and the same tactics that we continue to use and employ today. And when I think about, as a policy analyst, as a policy strategist, the work that I'm doing is so much focused on knowing the demands, understanding my targets, understanding the issues. And so what I learned from the boycott was they understood the history, they understood what it took to even get to the point where they were able to really create and build this movement, right? But they also remained really steadfast and committed and focused, frankly, on who exactly the targets were and who exactly were the people that they had to implore those demands towards. They understood power. And I think that even today, we still look at, as Kenesha pointed out, as we practice civil disobedience, as we practice nonviolent protests, we have to be so clear about our demands, about the policy changes that we want to see. And we have to be really incisive about what those policies have to look like in order to move us forward as a community. And so the truth is, this has given us the blueprint, and we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We continue to employ those same tactics today because we knew that they worked. As a young organizer in Montgomery today, I understand that we have a responsibility to carry the legacy of those who came before us. This was the very place where it gave us not just a moment, it gave us the rest of our history, the rest of even today to really continue this fight towards racial justice and equity, just as they were then.
So, Ms. Brown, you being a voting rights advocate and a community organizer, do you find a lot of people identifying with the struggles of the past, and do you find yourself having to remind or encourage people, that what's going on now is a continuation of the past? What's your relationship with the?
I look at it both ways. When we're out in neighborhoods talking to different people, and you have to consider the different walks of life and age differences and whatnot. You have some that remember, the Montgomery Bus Boycott vividly because it was 65 years ago. My mother is 62 years old. And even though it was, 3 years before she came into life, those stories still continue. So you have some that correlate what happened during the boycott and still saying that some of those injustices are still going on today. Then you have some who are not directly connected to that type of struggle, so they're a little removed from it. And they may be a little apathetic about it, have a little apathy about it or whatnot. But it's just more so of them not, I wouldn't say because they don't care, it's just that they can't really relate to it. So what we try to do, we just have those conversations and just kind of have issue-related discussions with them to where they can see that correlation. Although we have accomplished a lot from the boycott, and we have accomplished a lot over the years with the Voting Rights Act and other things, we still have had some setbacks. Even though with the Voting Rights of 1965, of course, that was gutted with Shelby v. Holder. And we're still dealing with that even now here in 2020, where we saw a lot of things pushed back, even during the COVID pandemic, where we would think that things would be made easier for people to vote, but we still had a lot of obstacles in play. Looking at it twofold, still have a long way to go, but we are seeing some stepping points. And then we have to just make sure that the messaging is connected to some of the present day people today.
Aurelia Browder is my great aunt. She married into the Browder family. I learned more about her through her son, Butler Browder, who's still living here in Montgomery, Alabama. When I talk to him about her, he always talks about the fact that she was an entrepreneur during the time of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. She was a doula. She owned several vehicles. She was a seamstress. There were so many facets to this woman. I wanted to continue to tell her story about the resiliency, the hope, the love, the perseverance that she displayed as an unsung hero of the civil rights movement. A couple of years ago, there was to be an erection of Richard Montgomery, General Richard Montgomery, in the heart of downtown Montgomery, Alabama, slave owner. And I thought to myself, why are we not trying to combat this? Why aren't we not standing up? And I said, Aurelia would be very upset with me if I didn't say something about this. She's always there with me in terms of when I do what I do as it relates to tours or just talking to young people. And then the Browder versus Gail, to know that she wasn't scared. She had the guts to be the lead plaintiff, to tell her story. So now that people are starting to get more and more engaged in Montgomery, we're doing it through art. We're painting murals that speak to the issues. You have to stand up. When the time is right, you have to speak truth to power. And so now there's a group of young people like America and, Kadida, young women, Valerie Adams, who are willing to now say, it's okay to speak truth to power. And so I'm happy to be amongst young folk coming up behind us and stirring the pot, if you will.
My name is Tori Jackson.
My name is Valerie Adams. We represent the Alabama Indigenous Coalition. I'm Oglala Lakota from South Dakota.
I'm Black Native American, and I'm a descendant of the Muskogee Nation. There is a major lack of education throughout the state of Alabama as far as Indigenous people go.
There's a lack of acknowledgement of Indigenous people in Alabama. So I think that when you look back at the bus boycott and what was happening in the very beginning of civil rights and all that voting, Native Americans, we didn't have access to all that. We were living on different reservations and fighting to survive.
My family was just trying to blend in, because another thing that people didn't think about was, they were mixed, and they did have Native American heritage, but they were still colored, so they were still drinking out of the colored water fountains, and they were still having to sit on the back of the bus. There was no difference. It was either you were white or you were colored.
We're living in these parallel universes where you have Black liberation and then you also have tribal sovereignty.
There's a commonality between African and Native, and it's interesting being from this perspective and having both of them. We're fighting for the same common goal, which is to reclaim ourselves in, unfortunately, a world of whitewashing.
We all are part of a community organization called Southerners on New Ground, SONG. So our work is a community involvement organization. The mission is to heighten the voices of Black people, Indigenous people, LGBTQ community, and basically just surround their issues and making sure that they are heard and they have a voice in the community.
For me personally, I don't think people just wake up and decide to be activists. I think there are things that happen in your life to just push you into that space. And something that happened for me was me advocating on my father's behalf to get him out of jail. So I had to realize, in that moment, I didn't have anybody to speak up for me. I had to speak up for myself, and I know what it feels like to be isolated when you have nobody to speak up for. So I just kind of took it upon myself to start speaking up for other people.
I agree with Kadida. It wasn't I just woke up and felt like I wanted to, just do this. It kind of just happened. I returned home from serving the military, retired, got back, and I saw my community at a standstill and probably just kind of just ghosting away. And I felt like something needed to happen. And so I just stepped up because I saw no one else was doing it, or maybe they were doing it and couldn't and needed a budge or like a little push. So I decided to jump out and do what I knew how to do best, which was speak out, say something, and just, make some everyday noise about what was wrong with the area and bring in some solutions.
Right, and I didn't seek out to be an activist either. I think, in the words of the late great John Lewis, we have a moral obligation to do what's right, get into good trouble, necessary trouble, and when you see something that isn't right, it's your obligation to say something and do something about it, and to continue his legacy. That's what inspired me throughout to be an activist. In the eyes of the 65th Bus Boycott, I don't think we ever left the bus boycott. I think it only evolved. What we've seen is racism being hid and racism being covered up, and the efforts that current activists are continuing with that were happening back in 1955 are similar efforts. Like I said, it never really stopped there, even though we were able to make strides. Our strides are not great enough. We're still being oppressed. We're still seeing racism all around us. It comes down to systematic racism at this point. We have racism in politics. We have racism in your workplace. We have racism in schools. So it never ended at the bus boycott, even though, they made their strides there. It only evolved to this point. I don't think there is an end game. I think that's what they want it to be, an end game. We're not letting up.
We want to send a direct message that that's done. Those days are over. We will fight for our children, just like our ancestors fought for our rights to vote. Now it's our job to continue that movement, and we're gonna fight for our children to have proper education, a quality education, equitable lives, and to have their children have that same thing.
Mr. Nettles, with the rise of social protests, in wake of various murders and various scenes of injustice by police officers and by citizens upon other citizens, how can we teach boycott history to assist in the creation of policy? Because a lot of people, they'll do the protests, but when it comes time to policy, the numbers kind of dwindle off. Tell us a little bit about that and your struggles as a director of policy for Alabama ACLU.
Political education is really the fuel that is behind every movement, and that's what they did so well during the bus boycott, is they educated the public on what really this meant for us, how in terms of being connected to the work, to the movement, everyone had a role to play. And I think that's really what we are trying to still do today. And we have so many more creative and new tools and options about how to go about that. But the truth is that it's still, as I was saying before, the same, rooted in the same practice. Political education fuels the type of policy strategies that we come up with. It fuels the decision-making about who and where we should be showing up and practicing civil disobedience, right? And so I think that it just goes back to us really investing and knowing that that is really the catalyst before everything else that happens. It's starting and rooting ourselves in our history and the education about what we are actually trying to achieve.
So, Ms. Brown, do you think that today's young people are willing to sacrifice to the same extent that those people were during the bus boycott? Do you see that devotion and dedication?
Yes. And we saw it actually this year. Just in casual conversations I've had with a few of my friends. I think, Dylan, we've talked about it and kind of joked about it, where we said Generation Z is going to be the one to save us all, because they're the ones right now, and they remind me a lot of the boomer generation. And when I say they remind me of the boomer generation, is that they're so pragmatic. They sit and they kind of, read the room, so to speak. They're looking at the issues that are happening, and they're sitting down and they're organizing around it. And they're making sure that they organize consistently around it. And kind of what we're seeing right now, what happened with, the protests from Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, even though the profile has kind of died down in terms of media or whatever, you still have people that are right there in Louisville, still organizing, still protesting. A lot of those are younger people that are organizing. And it kind of goes back to Dr. King. Dr. King was 26, right? And listening to different kind of movements that have happened over the years, it started at the root of young people. So that's still continuing right now.
So as far as sustained efforts, how does, let's say, a social protest today, how does that help you in the policy area? What's the relationship between the boots on the ground and the the policy making that takes place in the legislature, in Congress, or at a corporate boardroom? What's the relationship?
What they did so well about the boycott, and what I really want us to really work hard and continue to strive to do today, is they built coalitions, right? And what we have to do today, if we're going to really make policy change, if we're going to really move things in the Alabama legislature, and even in the city council, at whatever level of government, we have to have coalitions behind what we ultimately want to see. We have to have united fronts, intersectional fronts of individuals, of organizations coming together who are very focused on the goal, right? And so those boots on the ground outside of the State House, at the Capitol, outside of City Hall, wherever they may be, send a strong message to the decision makers, to the lawmakers, that there's a coalition of people who are not going to be moved until they reach their goal, right? This is a much stronger signal than me being out there by myself, or me as a policy director going and trying to make deals, trying to lobby, right? When the people are out there, when they're on the side of justice, of equity, then there really is no stopping that momentum. And they know that. And so when there's real lives out there who are being impacted and they're centered in the work, then they have to take those voices seriously. And all that I can do is be a conduit from the people who are out there, boots on the ground, to the decision makers to say, you've got a lot of people out here waiting on answers. And so where are they?
Dylan, can you tell us a little bit about some of the current policy issues that are emerging that require immediate attention?
Well, I think the issue at the forefront really is the way that mass incarceration continues to show up and divide and really disproportionately impact the Black community in Alabama. We represent about 26% of the state population. We are 52% of the population of people in custody in the Alabama Department of Corrections today. There's obviously a huge disparity there, and a lot of that it starts with policing, our communities being over-policed, but it goes right into sentencing, where we are being more harshly sentenced. We know Alabama's habitual felony offender law, essentially a 3 strikes law, is one of the harshest in the country. And then we see people who are incarcerated facing what are unconstitutional conditions. The U.S. Department of Justice has just in the last 2 years identified multiple human rights violations at the hands of correctional officers, at the hands of staff who are supposed to be responsible for the well-being of our people, of our community, ultimately in hopes that we're coming back home. And the truth is that we're spending lengthy sentences divided from our families. It hurts our local businesses, our economy within our community, our ability to sustain wealth within our community, to own homes. All of these are issues that continue today to disproportionately impact the Black community. And Alabama has one of the worst records on this in the country.
Kanisha, as far as you're a voting advocate, as far as voting is concerned, what emerging issues do you see with voting?
The good thing about this past election that we had on November 3rd was that turnout was probably one of the highest we've seen in any election cycle for a while. And I know a lot of us were kind of applauding and getting emotional about the long lines that we saw. Not only that was happening across the United States, but here in Alabama. But at the same time, we can't normalize that, because that is an issue where someone has to wait in line for hours to vote. Perfect example, and I can tie it in with my mom. My mom went to vote absentee in person at the courthouse, and she waited 4.5 hours to cast her vote in the pouring rain. That's something that I wouldn't imagine that would happen here, in 2020. So in dealing with that, a lot of other stuff that we saw during this election cycle was that our absentee voting system is cumbersome. We need to have no excuse absentee voting here. And even when we were selecting the option to vote absentee because of COVID, the wording on the application and the ballot were 2 different things. The wordings were different. And a lot of people were hesitant in selecting that option because they kind of felt that they were lying to vote absentee, because it's not saying that you don't want to vote because you're in fear of getting COVID. It's because you have a physical infirmity of illness. Some people were healthy and fine. They were just fearful of going to vote due to the pandemic. And what another thing that it brought too was that Alabama is in critical need of having early voting. Okay. We saw in places in Houston where Houston had their, I think it was their FedEx Center, that was open 24 hours for people to go vote at any time. And we just don't have that here in Alabama. So I hope that conversation carries on into our legislative session to probably have those type of options available here for people to vote. And of course, voter ID requirements, things like that, that hinder Black people and poor people to vote. We need to get rid of that here in Alabama.
If I can mention this too, Dr. White, I think one of the things that I quickly learned, I've grown up in Alabama, but one of the things I quickly learned coming to Montgomery and really beginning my work as an organizer was that they understood their power when they were organizing the boycott. I think what also happened, right, as a side effect, if you will, is, right, like the rest of the world saw our power too, right? And it feels like ever since then we've been fighting and trying to grasp, to hold on to all the gains that we're able to make from the boycott, through the movement. And today it feels like, especially this year, right? Like we are so much back into that kind of hostile ground of trying to hold on and to continuously fight for all of these achievements, for all of these gains that we made. But they also know, they knew that by gutting the Voting Rights Act, what that would do. They know by continuing to put a disproportionate amount of Black men particularly into jail cells, what that does to diminish our collective power and the action that we can do and bring together.
And in closing, one of the consistencies that I see regarding the legacy of resistance is the unwillingness to abandon those who are the least of these, or those who are the most vulnerable. And if we begin even with the resistance of slavery to the resistance of African Americans at the early part of the 20th century, even in Montgomery, to the 1950s with the emergence of the Women's Political Council, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, even into the African independence movement, there is a legacy of resistance to oppression that permeates amongst African and African American people. And the Montgomery Bus Boycott actually brought that to light. It was a coming out of a spirit that had existed before, but culminated in Montgomery, Alabama, to bring to the world a new ethos of dealing with human being and the nature of existence.
Hi, I'm Stephen Reed, Mayor of Montgomery, Alabama. I want to thank all of our partners for helping make tonight possible. Thank you for your involvement to make the last few days become a reality. We really appreciate your contributions, and we're really excited about all the engagement that we've gotten from everyone throughout the community. But we want to let you know, tonight is not the end. Check out mgmbusboycott.com for a list of more events that will be going on. And over the next 382 days, stay engaged as we'll be bringing more events to commemorate the 65th anniversary of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Thanks again.